clock struck midnight on November 16, 1944. A chill ran through the corridors of Sing Sing prison. Helen Ray Fowler, a 31-year-old black woman, took her final steps. She was about to make history, but not in a way anyone would wish.
I'm innocent.
Helen was to become the only black woman ever executed by New York State. The execution chamber loomed ahead. Helen's heart raced. She had maintained her innocence until the very end, but her pleas fell on deaf ears. The system had decided her fate. A fate sealed by a jury of 12 men, none of whom looked like her. Then silence. The electric chair hummed to life. In moments, Helen Ray Fowler was gone. Her death marked the end of a controversial case. It also highlighted the deep racial and social injustices of the time. The execution of Helen Ray Fowler raised many questions. Questions about race, justice, and equality. These questions still echo today. Her story, largely forgotten, deserves to be told. It serves as a stark reminder of how far we've come, and how far we still have to go in the pursuit of true justice. Helen Ray Fowler's story began long before that fateful night at Sing Sing. She was born in 1913 in Harlem, New York. Her childhood was far from easy. Helen grew up in a time of great racial tension. Opportunities for black Americans were limited. Education was a luxury many couldn't afford. Despite the odds, Helen dreamed of a better life. She was smart and ambitious, but poverty and discrimination stood in her way. As a young woman, Helen worked various jobs to make ends meet. She cleaned houses, worked in laundries, and did whatever she could to survive. The Great Depression hit her community hard. Every day was a struggle. In her 20s, Helen married and had 2 children. But her marriage was troubled. Her husband was abusive. Helen often found herself alone, trying to care for her kids. The strain of single motherhood in a society stacked against her was immense. She did her best, but times were tough. World War II brought new challenges and opportunities. Many men, including black men, were drafted. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Helen hoped for a chance at a better job, but racial barriers remained strong. She continued to struggle, doing her best to provide for her children. Little did she know that her life was about to take a dramatic turn. On a cold February night in 1944, tragedy struck. An elderly white couple was found dead in their Manhattan apartment. The victims were William and Florence Bird. They had been brutally beaten and robbed. The city was in shock. The police were under pressure to solve the case quickly. Helen Ray Fowler became a suspect. She had worked for the Birds as a cleaner. The police claimed she knew about money kept in the apartment. They accused her of conspiring with 2 men to rob the couple. The men were identified as Robert Mays and George Small. Both were also black. The evidence against Helen was largely circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses. No murder weapon was found. But the police were convinced they had their culprits. Helen, Mays, and Small were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution sought the death penalty for all 3. New York was in an uproar. The case made headlines across the city. Many called for swift justice. Others questioned the rush to judgment. Race played a significant role in public opinion. Some saw the case as a clear example of black criminality. Others saw it as yet another instance of racial scapegoating. The stage was set for a trial that would captivate and divide the city. The trial of Helen Ray Fowler began in the spring of 1944. The courtroom was tense. All eyes were on Helen and her co-defendants. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded murder. They claimed Helen had provided inside information about the Birds. This, they said, led to the deadly robbery. But the defense told a different story. They pointed out the lack of physical evidence. There were no fingerprints linking Helen to the crime scene. No stolen items were found in her possession. Helen's lawyer argued that she was being railroaded. He suggested that her race and poverty made her an easy target for the police. The jury deliberated for hours. They seemed uncertain. At one point, they asked the judge to clarify the law. This showed they were struggling with the decision. But in the end, they returned a guilty verdict. Helen and her co-defendants were convicted of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. Many observers were shocked by the outcome. The evidence seemed thin. Helen had no prior criminal record. She was a mother of 2 young children, but none of this seemed to matter. The jury had spoken. Helen Ray Fowler was headed to death row. Her fate now rested in the hands of the appeals courts. Section 5. The Felony Murder Rule, a legal quagmire. At the heart of Helen Ray Fowler's conviction was a controversial legal doctrine. It's called the Felony Murder Rule. This rule allows prosecutors to charge someone with murder, even if they didn't directly kill anyone. All that's needed is proof they participated in a felony that resulted in death. In Helen's case, the prosecution used this rule to devastating effect. They argued that even if Helen didn't physically harm the birds, she was still guilty of murder. Why? Because she allegedly helped plan the robbery. The jury accepted this argument. It sealed Helen's fate. Critics of the felony murder rule say it's unjust. They argue it can lead to excessive punishments. Someone who never intended to kill can end up on death row. This was exactly what happened to Helen. She maintained she had no knowledge of the robbery plan. But under the felony murder rule, that didn't matter. The use of this rule in Helen's case raised serious questions. Was it fair to sentence her to death based on such an expansive definition of murder? Many legal experts said no. They argued that the felony murder rule disproportionately affects minorities and the poor. Helen's case seemed to prove their point. But at the time, these arguments fell on deaf ears. Section 6. Appeals and last-minute pleas. After her conviction, Helen Ray Fowler's legal team sprang into action. They filed appeal after appeal. They argued that the trial had been unfair, that the evidence was insufficient, and that racial bias had played a role in the verdict. But each appeal was denied. The higher courts upheld the conviction. As her execution date approached, Helen's supporters grew desperate. They launched a public campaign for clemency. Letters poured into the governor's office. Religious leaders spoke out. Even some who believed in Helen's guilt argued that execution was too harsh a punishment. But the governor remained unmoved. In the final days, Helen's lawyers made one last attempt. They filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court. It was a long shot. The highest court in the land rarely intervenes in state executions. Helen and her supporters waited anxiously for news. But on November 15, 1944, the Supreme Court declined to hear the case. With all legal options exhausted, Helen faced her fate. Her final hours were spent with a prison chaplain. She wrote letters to her children. She maintained her innocence until the end. But the wheels of justice, once set in motion, proved unstoppable. At midnight, Helen Ray Fowler walked to the electric chair. Her story was about to become a tragic footnote in New York's legal history. Section 7, Race and Justice in 1940s America. Helen Ray Fowler's case didn't happen in a vacuum. It was a product of its time. 1940s America was deeply segregated. Racial discrimination was the norm, not the exception. This affected every aspect of life, including the justice system. Black Americans faced enormous hurdles in court. All white juries were common, especially in cases with black defendants. This was true in Helen's trial. Not a single black person sat on the jury that decided her fate.
Studies have shown that this lack of diversity can lead to biased outcomes. Jurors tend to be more sympathetic to defendants who look like them.
The police force was another source of racial disparity. In the 1940s, few police departments had black officers. Those that did often relegated them to limited roles. This meant that investigations involving black suspects were usually conducted by white officers. Cultural misunderstandings and racial stereotypes could easily influence these investigations. Legal representation was another major issue. Most black defendants couldn't afford good lawyers. Public defenders were often overworked and underprepared. This put black defendants at a severe disadvantage in court. Helen's case highlighted all these issues. Her conviction and execution were as much a product of systemic racism as they were of the specific facts of her case. Section 8. Sing Sing's Dark History. Sing Sing Prison, where Helen Ray Fowler spent her final days, has a long and troubled history. Built in 1825, it quickly gained a reputation for harshness. Conditions were brutal. Prisoners faced overcrowding, disease, and frequent violence. By the 1940s, some reforms had been made, but Sing Sing remained a feared institution. The prison's death house was particularly notorious. Between 1891 and 1963, 614 men and women were executed there. The vast majority were killed in the electric chair. This device, nicknamed Old Sparky, was seen as a more humane alternative to hanging, but accounts of executions suggest it was often a gruesome and painful death. Helen Ray Fowler was one of only 4 women ever executed at Sing Sing. All 4 were killed in a span of just 5 years, from 1939 to 1944. This cluster of female executions was unusual. It reflected changing attitudes about crime and punishment. Women were increasingly seen as capable of serious crimes. The idea of female innocence was fading. Sing Sing's death house was finally closed in 1963. New York abolished the death penalty in 1965. The prison itself still operates today, but its days as a place of execution are long over. Helen Ray Fowler's death marked the end of an era. She was the last woman and the only black woman ever executed by New York State. Section 9. The Aftermath, Public Reaction, and Media Coverage. The execution of Helen Ray Fowler sent shockwaves through New York. Reactions were mixed and often divided along racial lines. Many white New Yorkers saw the execution as justice served. They believed Helen was guilty and deserved her punishment. But in black communities, the mood was very different. For many black New Yorkers, Helen's case was yet another example of injustice. They saw a system that was quick to convict and execute a black woman. Many believed Helen was innocent. Others thought that even if she was involved, the death penalty was too harsh. Protests and vigils were held in Harlem and other black neighborhoods. The media coverage of the case was extensive, but often biased. Many newspapers portrayed Helen in a negative light. They focused on sensational details rather than the complexities of the case. Few reporters questioned the fairness of the trial or the use of the death penalty. Black-owned newspapers provided a different perspective. They highlighted the racial aspects of the case and called for reform. In the years following Helen's execution, her case faded from public memory. It became a footnote in legal textbooks. But for those who remembered, it remained a powerful symbol. It showed how race, poverty, and flawed legal doctrines could combine to deadly effect. Helen Ray Fowler's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when justice goes wrong. Section 10. Lessons from Helen's Story, Then and Now. The execution of Helen Ray Fowler happened almost 80 years ago, but her story still holds important lessons for today. Many of the issues raised by her case remain relevant. Racial disparities in the justice system continue to be a major problem. Black Americans are still more likely to be arrested, convicted, and given harsh sentences. The felony murder rule, which played a key role in Helen's conviction, is still on the books in many states. Critics argue that it leads to unfair outcomes. It can result in life sentences, or even executions for people who never intended to kill. Some states have reformed or abolished the rule, but it remains a controversial aspect of criminal law. The death penalty itself remains a hotly debated topic. Since Helen's time, many states have abolished capital punishment. Others have placed moratoriums on executions. Concerns about racial bias, wrongful convictions, and the humanity of execution continue to fuel these debates. Helen's case is often cited as an example of why the death penalty is problematic. Perhaps the most important lesson from Helen's story is the need for vigilance. Justice systems can make mistakes. Bias can influence outcomes. It's crucial to question and challenge unfair practices. Helen Ray Fowler didn't have many advocates in her time. Today, organizations fight for justice reform. They work to prevent cases like Helen's from happening again. Her story reminds us why this work is so important. Section 11. Remembering Helen Ray Fowler, a call for justice reform. As we reflect on Helen Ray Fowler's story, we're called to action. Her case isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a challenge to our present. It asks us to examine our current justice system, to look for the Helen Ray Fowlers of today, to ask ourselves if we're doing enough to ensure true justice for all. Remembering Helen means more than just recounting her story. It means working to address the systemic issues her case revealed. This includes fighting racial bias in policing and courts. It means reforming laws like the felony murder rule. It involves ensuring adequate legal representation for all defendants. These are big challenges, but they're necessary if we want a truly fair justice system. Helen's story also reminds us of the power of storytelling. For decades, her case was largely forgotten, but by bringing it to light, we honor her memory. We also shed light on similar cases, past and present. Stories like Helen's can inspire change. They can move people to action. They can help us see the human cost of injustice. In the end, Helen Ray Fowler's legacy is complex. She was a victim of her time, a flawed system.
A beacon of hope, shining through the dark, dispelling every pain, leaving my mark. Love's everlasting chain, it keeps us connected. This hip-hop remix feels so resurrected. I'm spitting fire, bringing all the heat. With every rhyme I drop, I sweep you off your feet. I'm the lyrical miner, the ruler of this rap. With every line I write, I make your head snap. I'm breaking bounds, smashing all the walls in this hip-hop remix. I'm the strongest of them all. I'm the strongest of them all. I'm the strongest of them all.